Hello everyone, this is going to be a quick lecture on the different structures of plants. So this is a plant. I think everybody's seen a plant before. If not, this is what it looks like. So the plant is composed of a lot of different parts. So you have the roots, which are down here. That's the root system of the plant. You have your leaves, the stem, which is basically the central part where everything branches out of, and then you have flowers. You have buds as well for some that don't have flowers yet. And then the seeds, of course, are eventually going to come from the flower. Um, in terms of the root systems, which is kind of the first part, there's two types. You have your tap roots, and then you have your fibrous root systems. So you have fibrous root systems in things that are called monocots. So monocots have some interesting characteristics, like if you look at a banana leaf, you're going to see that the veins are all parallel. Versus if you look at an oak tree, you're going to have like a central vein, and everything is going to be kind of branching out of it. And these are dicots. So carrots in this case are dicots, grass or corn in this case is going to be a monocot. But the taproot system, basically you have a big central root and then you have little tiny hairs coming out of it, versus a fibrous root system, everything kind of emerges from here and kind of just branches out. In terms of the taproot system, it's a little bit more complex. You have places where you have a lot of secondary roots popping out, which are basically just little roots that come out of the main root, and then at the end you have a lot of root hairs, and there's a couple different purposes for them, but really it's about increasing surface area so that the plant can absorb more water and more nutrients, because this is the way that the plant uptakes some things like magnesium, calcium, and other important ions that it needs. The primary root is typically just going to grow downward, kind of extending itself, and as it extends it's basically going to widen, and then produce a lot more secondary roots. A fibrous root system, like I said before, everything is basically going to be coming out of here. So they're all kind of like little roots. And then occasionally you have a couple of little branches popping out of them. Um, but in terms of organization, there's no clear organization. Everything just kind of branches out. Like if you go to a park and you pull out like a chunk of grass, I hope you don't go to parks and rip out chunks of grass. But if you did, you'd probably see this fibrous root system, because this is more common in things like grasses. So pause the video really quick just for a couple of seconds and see if you can identify if it's a taproot system or a fibrous root system. Roots have several different functions, and there's actually four of them that I'm going to talk about. The first is absorbing water and nutrients through the root hairs, like I had mentioned earlier. The second is transportation of water and nutrients to the stem and throughout the plant. So if you think about I'm sorry, there's a lot of buses outside. If you have like a cup of water and you put a straw in it, the water doesn't just automatically go all the way up the straw and then start pouring out of the straw, because that's really not how it works. You have to suck on the straw to be able to get the water out or the liquid out. And in this case, plants work in a very similar way. They don't necessarily like suck up water. Water evaporates from the leaves, and because it evaporates, it kind of pulls the water that's down by the roots upward. So water has to be pulled upwards by evaporation. If water doesn't evaporate, you cannot absorb any more water. The third function is anchoring plants to the ground. If there's a lot of wind, if there's water, anything that could potentially remove the plant from where it is, it's not going to be good for the plant. So like in places where you have a lot of wind, like in plains, and even here in the desert, you have really thick, deep roots to help anchor the plant. In places like, if you go to Florida, in the Everglades, you're going to see these really, really big roots on the mangrove trees, because that's kind of where they anchor themselves to the ground, not to be swept away into the water. And also we have storage of food and water. If you think of something like potatoes and beets, carrots, they store a lot of food in there in the form of starch, which is the type of food that plants usually make after they do photosynthesis and make a lot of glucose, and they're also important for storing water. These things, whenever the plant gets cut off from the surface, the stuff that's basically in its root systems is what's going to allow it to regrow and go back to being a plant. In terms of the parts of the root, you have several different components, but it really is just I guess three major ones. You have your epidermis, which is your skin. You have your cortex, which is kind of this fleshy stuff right there. And then you have your vascular tissue that's arranged in the center. So this is a monocot root and this is a dicot root. In a monocot, it's kind of just scattered throughout, but in a dicot, there's a little bit more of a clearer arrangement, like you see here with that X. In terms of the growth of a root, there's a root cap at the base of every root, and that kind of provides both lubrication and a mechanism of actively dividing cells so that the root can continue to push itself downward and growing downward into the ground. Root hairs, of course, I've already mentioned their roles, but again, if you didn't get it, it's about absorbing things, nutrients, water. And then you have your vascular tissues. So vascular tissues do two things. They transport water up the plant, and they help transport sugars and starches down to the roots. So water and nutrients go up, sugars go down. Leaves are really important. We've talked about photosynthesis before. So photosynthesis is basically the process of making sugars from carbon dioxide and water, as well as sunlight. This is how plants make their food. They can't eat like you and I. They don't have a stomach. So basically all the sugar that they get, that's what they're using to fuel their metabolism. Transpiration is the loss of water in exchange for carbon dioxide, and evapotranspiration is the process that I talked about, like drinking from a straw. You have to lose water to be able to take more water from the roots. It's kind of like it creates this sucking motion within the plant that allows water to move up. And in things like trees, by the way, this happens a lot. Like you have a ton of these vessels that move via bulk flow. So if you think about it, it's like having 100,000 straws sucking up water at the same time, which ends up being a lot of water. But anyway, moving on to the leaf parts, you have the blade of the leaf, which is basically like the whole leaf, the petiole, which is a little stalk that attaches to the stem, and then a midrib, which is typically a vein that transports water throughout the leaf, and nutrients, and also brings down the sugars. You also have other parts like the apex. The apex is the tip of the leaf, this thing right there. The base is what attaches it to the petiole, which is somewhere down here. The margin is going to be the edge of the leaf. The epidermis is going to be the outer layers of the leaf. The stomata are, of course, on the underside of the leaf. They're what helps exchange some of the gases. And the mesophyll, this is the stuff that's in the middle of the leaf. And I'm going to show you a diagram of what that looks like right now. So this right here is the cross-section of a leaf. You have your mesophyll cells right here. These are the cells that are going to be performing the photosynthesis. You're going to have a cuticle on top, which is typically like a waxy layer that helps protect water loss. You have the epidermis, which is kind of the upper skin, and the lower epidermis, which is the lower skin. You have your guard cells and your stomata, which are the pores, and then you have your blood vessels, your plant vessels, your veins, the things that are helping transport water, sugars, and nutrients throughout the plant. The functions of the stem, of course, are to transport water and nutrients, and also support leaves, fruit, and any flowers. Not only that, some stems can actually have cells that store food, not necessarily in the roots, but as part of the stem. The stem has several different parts. You have the nodes, which are basically the places where you have the growth of branches and leaves. Then you have the internode, which is the space that's in between them. Xylem is dead tissue that carries up water and nutrients, and phloem is living tissue that carries down sugars down to the roots. You also have some piths, which are basically places where the plant stores sugars that doesn't necessarily have to get all the way down from the roots. The function of flowers is going to be sexual reproduction, and if you didn't know that, flowers are an adaptation that land plants use to reproduce. They have different pollinators. You have the wind, which is something that's really common. There's some species of trees and grass, for the most part, depends on the wind for pollination. And yes, grass has flowers. They're just really small. Insects help pollinate a lot of plants. There's a lot of insects around the world. There's really a ton of plants that are highly specialized to attract specific insects. For example, if you want a lot of bees, usually yellow flowers do the trick. If you want things like moths are typically attracted to white flowers. They're only there at night. But one of the things about white flowers is since they have no color to be attractive, they spend a lot more time on smelling really good. So white flowers tend to smell the best, and they're really good for like night pollinators like moths, bats also. So bats are really important for, I guess, pollinating things like cacti and different types of flowers. And then birds are also really important pollinators, things like hummingbirds and other species of birds. And these guys are a little bit more attracted to things like red flowers. So depending on what kind of organism you may want to bring into your backyard, um, color of flowers is definitely something that I would look at. So in terms of the female equivalent of plant parts, you have the pistil, which is the complete unit. Okay, so the pistil is comprised of three things. You have your ovary, which is at the base of the pistil. You have your style, which is like a little stem. And then you have the stigma, which is a little bit sticky, and it's at the top of the pistil that's meant to catch the pollen of a flower so that it can go and fertilize the ovary and then create seeds. If you've ever looked at a strawberry, those little things that are kind of on the surface of it that look like seeds, they're actually pistils. They're female flowers that are on the surface of the strawberry. Yeah, there are male flowers and there are female flowers. Sometimes there's perfect flowers that have both male and female parts. But in the case of the strawberry, they basically have two houses. One flower houses the female parts and another flower houses the male parts. But yeah, this is the female structure. The male structure, or male equivalent structure, is called the stamen, and it's really simple. You have two things. You have the filament, which is like a little stalk, and then you have the anther, which is the part of it that produces the pollen. Like I said, some flowers only have female parts, some of them have male parts, some of them have both. And basically, that's it for the male flowers. The overall structure of them looks a little bit like this. So this is an angiosperm, which is a flowering plant. It has petals, which are the colorful ones. At the base of them, you have something called the nectary gland. So this is where nectar is produced, over here somewhere at the bottom. You have sepals. So whenever you have a flower bud, that bud is protected by the sepal. So this sepal it's almost like leafy petals that help protect the flower when it's not open. The collection of all the petals together is called the corolla. The collection of all the sepals together is called the calyx. You have, of course, the stamen, the pistil, and in here, this is where the ovaries are, and this is where you're going to have the fruits develop from and the seeds develop from. This is the receptacle. This is where everything is held together. And then, of course, your pedicel, which is the stalk that holds up the flower. Like I said, the petals are really important for attracting pollinators, and the nectar that's produced at the bottom is also really important for attracting a lot of those pollinators. There are some organisms that cheat, though, like bumblebees. Bumblebees and ants are some of the most, I guess, cheating type of insects. So instead of going like up here, bumblebees like to go here, and they will chew through the sepals and the petals, and they'll access the nectary glands without pollinating certain types of flowers. And again, they're not like doing this for every type of flower, but they do it for a lot of flowers. So they're kind of cheaters. And ants do the same thing. They just crawl in here, and they take the nectar without pollinating. So there are your lazy insects as well. Parts of the seed. The seeds are really important because they help ensure the survival of the species by allowing plants to kind of go different places. The embryo is basically the part of the seed that is the active organism part. So you have a plume, which is like a little shoot. You have a hypocotyl, which is a stem, and then a radicle, which is going to be the root. So this is the growing embryo inside of things like beans and different types of seeds. The endosperm is going to be the nutritive tissue. So this is where plants are going to get their nutrition when they're in seed form. A cotyledon is basically one of those food storages. So some of them have two, like dicots. Some of them have one, like monocots. So things like corn, they only have one cotyledon. Things like beans, they're dicots, they're going to have two cotyledons. And then you also have the seed coat, which is the protective layer that surrounds the seed. This is really important because it helps prevent germination or the beginning of growth of seeds whenever conditions are not favorable. So there needs to be enough water. Sometimes seed coats have to be broken up by things like, I don't know, fires and some type of forest. But also you have things like chili peppers that you don't really think about. Like to us, mammals, chili peppers are really spicy. So we're not supposed to eat them. That's why they're spicy. Why are they spicy? Well, they're actually meant to be eaten by birds because the seeds of peppers have to go through the intestinal tract of another animal before they can begin to germinate or begin to grow. And that other animal is basically just birds. So birds don't have the same reaction to chili peppers like we do. So to them, they're not spicy, they're just delicious. So the seeds have to be eaten by birds, digested or partially digested to remove the seed coat, and then when they poop them out, then they're ready to grow. So again, birds are really important for things like chili peppers, but again, that seed coat is very important for that. You don't want to start germinating if there's not favorable conditions. So here we have the different, or the cotyledon for a dicot. So you have this nutritive tissue, and then here's like the plume, here's your hypocotyl, and then your radicle is eventually going to start growing. That's going to be the primary root that grows out of cotyledons, or out of seeds for dicots. In terms of monocots, things like corn, you have that endosperm right here. This is that nutritive tissue. You have your radicle down here. And then you have a little bit of a different structure on the inside. But at the end of the day, they all kind of have a little radicle that grows into a root, and then those roots start developing into the root system. Like you see right here, these are all kind of parallel veined, versus if you looked at the other slide, they're a little bit more branched. So again, that's another difference from the monocots to dicots.